practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. John Maynard Keynes. Kids ask the best questions, like the one I am sure most economists who have children get at some point in their lives. Mom or Dad, what do you actually do? Not only have my own children asked that question, but even my mother couldn't understand why I wanted to go on after finishing college to earn a doctorate in economics. She told me to go to law school instead because it would enable me to get a real job. So I went to a school that let me earn both degrees, on the theory that at a relatively young age, it would be best to diversify. One reason I have written this book is to tell you why my instincts about economics were right. Not just for me, but many others in the very practical world of business and policy making. I suspect most everyone who is not an economist thinks economists are trained to be soothsayers, predictors of how the economy will perform over coming months, and perhaps a year or two, or longer, to tell us how much inflation or unemployment will rise or fall, and how fast total output, GDP, or gross domestic product, will or will not grow. Perhaps even more important, many non-economists may believe that economists can tell them what's going to happen to the stock market, and maybe their particular stocks, and to the prices of their houses. Some highly respected economists have essentially agreed. As the late Nobel laureates Milton Friedman and Lawrence Klein have argued, the ultimate test of the worth of economics is the accuracy of its predictions. If that is the case, then the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 and the subsequent Great Recession and slow recovery since have probably changed a lot of minds about economists, but not for the better. Few economists warned of these events in advance or in time for most people to sell their stocks, or not to borrow so much against their houses, or buy them at all before housing prices in many areas began to fall in 2006. If instead many economists had issued their warnings in time, maybe policymakers in the United States and elsewhere would have clamped down on extending easy credit to many U.S. homeowners who couldn't afford them, especially for mortgages requiring little or no money down, thus minimizing the growth of the housing bubble. Maybe elected officials wouldn't have pressed the two housing giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to buy or guarantee so many securities backed by subprime mortgages that later went sour. And maybe financial regulators would have pressed the nation's banks, especially the largest banks, to fund more of their assets with shareholders' money so they would have had a greater cushion against mortgage losses that later would bring some of them down and push others in the desperate position of having to take government investments to keep them afloat. But none of that happened. Instead, even the two economists thought to be in the best position to predict future hard times and to recommend measures to avoid, or at least minimize them, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, publicly indicated that the economy was doing pretty well up until the crisis. They didn't even warn that when the housing market turned downward and borrowers began defaulting, the rot would slow the rest of the economy. Perhaps they each believed these things would happen, but as public officials whose every word is sliced and diced by the media and the public, they couldn't voice their misgivings out loud without triggering mass panic and thus the very crisis they wanted to avoid.